Okay, so one of the things I want to talk about is animals as environments. And I'm going to try to talk about maybe more specifically pets and dogs and the kind of environmental role that they play. And this is being partly precipitated by the fact that we're hosting the Media Ecology Association convention here at Grand Valley about a little over a week from now. And so if you're in the area, come on down. If you're a student, you can attend for free. Douglas Rushkoff is giving out copies of his book for everyone who's in attendance. We're going to have a Friday telepresence session. It's going to be a Google Hangout live time here for anyone who wants to get involved. It's through this channel, and it will be from 9 a.m. to 10:15 on Eastern time and Eastern Standard, and it will be Douglas Rushkoff, Paul Levinson, and Mark Nunes, and they're going to talk about the meaning of telepresence and how we're to understand the future of some of this stuff. I think it'll be a very lively discussion and very interesting things going on. But the larger issue for I guess attendees is the theme Media Ecology Unplugged, and we're going to try to talk about what does it mean to look at those kinds of unplugged technologies. And when we talk about unplugged technologies, we mean both all of those technologies which preceded the electric revolution, things that require a plug, and then all those things that now have been launched on the other side by way of wireless and satellite and nanotech and biotech. And so there seems to be an unplugging area that could be of interest to people who study media ecology. And for people who aren't familiar with media ecology, let me just say a couple things about that. One is that media ecology is the study of media forms as environmental. Right? You try to understand a media form as not just being a thing within an already given space-time, but as introducing new spatial temporal orientations, kind of having social psychological impact, and by psychologically organizing and anticipating and forming expectations in certain ways, as well as sociologically, the kind of dynamics, social order, and the kind of processes that unfold. They have a resonance or a concurrence with those media forms that become dominant. But in the same way, right? In the same way that a medium becomes environmental, on the other hand of it, you could see that all environments mediate, that there's an environmental mediation that comes from things like architecture, urban planning, cityscapes, and the design that becomes more environmental. And so it's this reversibility between technologies as environments, environments as mediums, right? And to try to deal with some of those kinds of relations. Now, the history of media ecology is so rich, so broad. I think that the three big folks are Marshall McLuhan, Walter Ong, and Neil Postman. But there are so many other people, people like Eric Havelock, people like well, I guess you'd say Louis Mumford, Jacques Ellul, but certainly Suzanne Langer, Dorothy Lee, Christine Nystrom. I mean, there have been a whole host of people who have, again, they're rangy, different groups. They have addressed so many different areas, and they're spanning topics from, as I say, the earlier Unplugged, things like what is literacy, even what is language, what is expression, how are nonverbal comportments and gestures and poses part of communicative process, and by that sense, how do they become part of the environment in which other organisms find themselves? But it's literacy and calendars and schedules, and has to do with the history of clocks and mirrors, and to try to understand how the clock and the mirror, they're not items that were simply placed inside an already existing environment. Now, one can try to think about it that way, but there's another sense in which each time one of these technologies is introduced, it sort of reorganizes, reestablishes, and resets this space and time that the people find themselves in by way of that technology, right? That is, the mirror isn't just an item within space and time. It is that item by which we come to know ourselves, experience it ourselves, and have certain expectations for ourselves within a new environment, right? A pen, a pen isn't just an object in your hand. It's part and parcel of a literate environment which pen holders can be within. Okay, on the other hand of this, as I have already briefly mentioned, right, there are a great number of technologies that are now coming out after the plug. So the plug had this huge impact, right? It was the big radio, TV, and the internet, right? When they first began, these are major plug-in devices, but they've now surpassed that, and we went from pre-plug to plug to now increasingly unplugged. And one of the great you have Bluetooth, satellite, and you have various kinds of wireless technologies that have really revolutionized the kinds of space and time that we're in. I mean, just take the cell phone. I mean, the phone isn't just an item within your hand. I mean, that's what it is when the power goes out. When there is no electrical grid and all the signals stop, then you just have an item within your hand, quotes, in the space-time of your senses. But once that thing is activated to its full potential, it's not a thing in your environment. You are in the environment that it makes possible. Everything from its GPS to your ability to access archival information, whether it's old emails or historical documents on the web, or whether you're going to check future weather. The thing radically changes your sense of space and time and the kind of social dynamics of the environment that you're in. Right? It's not just adding to an environment, is revolutionizing by overlay, creating an environment that new cell phone users are in. And we can see the same thing that's happening now with things like robotics and nanotech and some of the various advances in biotech. These are wholly unplugged. Okay, there's a long intro into what I want to talk about is the issue of dogs in particular. Now, we could go to agriculture and talk about plants and animals as being environmentally cultivated, and to some extent they're now media forms, right? That they're not just things within our environment, but we've come to live in the environment that these cultivated technologies, right, have made possible. But rather than deal with cows and some of the oddities that has, which is interesting, I thought dogs would be one of the most interesting. That is, there are some thinkers. I'll see if I can find the link. If I can, I'll post it. There are some thinkers who think that the story of the human-dog relation is somewhat misunderstood. I think many people want to celebrate and recognize dogs as, quotes, man's best friend, as the great companion of humans, and the way that through selective breeding people they've cultivated and created a kind of living technology called the modern dog. The story told from other places, some other folks, what they would say is that in many ways dogs made humans, and that humans are as they are today only because of dogs, that it was much more of a symbiotic relationship than it was one of ownership. I think we today see ourselves in such obvious isolation, superiority. We control the breeding of the dogs, sell the puppies, all this kind of stuff, and that it covers over the kind of symbiotic relationship that was there historically as the human emerged. That is, there are some questions about whether humans as humans would have grown into being human as we now know it, had they not been groomed and cultivated in a dog-like environment. And the dogs were, again, not things in the human environment so much as part of the environment in which humans came to understand themselves, grow themselves. Some people believe the hierarchical orientations of humans is partly attributable to the kinds of experiences they've had with pack animals and dogs in particular. And I guess what I want to get at is just maybe some more ways of talking about how dogs are environments. That is, so I have my little Pomeranian Kiki, and she's a very good-looking dog. She's very well behaved. She looks sort of regal, kind of prances, and she, she's surprisingly human-like. She doesn't bark, except under maybe rare circumstance. She normally wants to hang out with people rather than with other dogs. Doesn't like to go out in the rain. Doesn't like to get muddy. Kind of prefers just the company of people. And it's interesting because when I take her out on walks, or we go out on walks, I may have talked about some of this in another video, but my wife and I are both professors, and our neighbors are very friendly, but in some way they see us as sort of, we're in a working class neighborhood, and we walk around. And before we had the dog, we seemed somewhat strange and aloof, and they were, I don't know, intimidated, or they thought we were a couple of academic eggheads, and what would be the point of talking with us, something like this. And then we got the dog, and suddenly the dog became the mediating relationship with just about every neighbor. I mean, not only would people come up and approach you if you have a dog and say, "Oh, what a cute dog," and they'll talk about the dog, and then they'll talk with you in a way that if you didn't have a dog, they would never come up and talk with you. But suddenly, it's this meta-level message, which is you're able to relate to others on more than something like beliefs about stuff, right? So when my wife and I are walking the dog, and we've come to meet so many neighbors who also have dogs, and the dogs sniff, and then we do this little chit-chat, but it isn't just that introductory, the dogs were the gateway to make social introductions elsewhere. It was that there is this, again, as I'm saying, a meta-level statement that there's a relating between organisms, in this case between a human and a dog, that isn't based upon beliefs. And when I say beliefs, I mean it's not based on political affiliations, religious beliefs, whether or not one thinks this or that about topic X. See, so much of our lives have become agreement and disagreement over whether one is a feminist, isn't a feminist. Is one religious, is one not religious? Well, what religion? Are you a Democrat? Are you a socialist? Are you a Republican? Are you a right-winger? What is it? And the more that people build their lives into those kinds of environments based on abstractions, and they're kind of removed from a concrete experience of now reality. I wonder how healthy of an environment that is. And if there isn't a kind of psychological health that comes from returning to the way of the dog. The Diogenes the dog in the ancient world, sometimes called little Socrates, as compared to Socrates, but he would urinate as a response to someone's, what he thought to be a bad argument. He would do things that were, outlandish, but in some way really physically grounding one back into what does it mean to be without beliefs? And again, it's somewhat comical, but when you think of even beginner mind, dog mind, there are some Buddhist orientations where one tries to learn to adopt the mindset of the animal as best one can. I think anyone who has a dog, who spent a lot of time with a dog, you will gaze countless hours into the dog's eyes, wondering what the dog is seeing, how it's experiencing this co-presence, what exactly is the relationship between you and it from its perspective. How is it comprehended and lived through, or if not thought about, how is it felt? Dogs certainly are, modern dogs are very attentive to comparative valuations of worth. If you take your dog around other dogs and you start to love up and pet up another dog, you can make your dog sulk and be jealous, right? Again, certain kinds of dogs. Um, I wonder too how much of early religious belief is partly attributable to the kind of comparative intelligences that we experience with the human dog relationship. So it's as if dogs, they seem to have an intelligibility, and they're aware, they're understanding what's going on, but they're unable to articulately express what they're finding intelligible. It's somehow there, but below the cusp of articulate expression. And yet we can say to the dog, when you look at the dog, ask the dog, do you want, and then does it want to go outside? Does it need a treat, whatever? And it will respond in some way. And so it was like it was there, and it's excited to see that you were able to read its mind. It was fascinated that that could happen. And there seems to be, we're aware of the larger situation, that we can see the dog has a hurt paw or is suffering in some way, is in an awkward situation and is nervous. The storm is coming, and you're trying to ease the anxieties of the dog. And that level of, I have an understanding of what it's going through, but surpassing it at that. And if that isn't a source of a kind of dialectical imagination of, just as we have an intelligence that seems in some way to over encompass the dog, we imagine that there must be some kind of intelligence that over encompasses us, right? I think again that might be part of that originary, that drive. I think, maybe the way to just round it off is to get at, I wonder how many people just all beliefed out. I think sometimes I feel that way. I'm at my limit for how much I can believe anymore. And I'm talking about anything and everything that's said or sayable, something that someone could talk about or explain. And instead of that, I'm increasingly interested in those forms of interaction that don't have any belief. The silent walking the dog, the petting the dog, watching the dog chase the squirrels, and minimizing the role of belief in life. That to continuously haggle about beliefs, and to think about how interesting it is that I can have a pretty good bond with my dog. I mean, we can really relate, get along. We seem to enjoy each other's company. She will come and just want to sit on the floor in the same room that I'm in. If she's over there, I'll go in that room and I'll sit down and I'll read there. And it's not like we're always hanging out, but there's this sort of preference there, and yet none of it is based on belief. None of it is because she came to me and told me that this was her view, and she thinks this about vegetarians, and she believes this about this religion or about that political affiliation. The lack of any belief, and yet the reality of the relationship. I think that's, to me, really some of the good stuff and stuff worth further pursuing. Okay, thanks.